Acrobat, one of the 3 assassin archetypes and the poster child for flying playstyles. The archetype is a fan favorite amongst the player base with countless videos and guides dedicated towards it, including one from 1-10? Huh?
You can see I'm accidentally casting some wrong spells here because spell cycling is not my forte.
Although Acrobat is one of the most played archetypes in raids, it hasn't always been this way. Acro is often praised for its fast and dynamic playstyle, however it's also been subject to an equal amount of mockery due to its less than stellar damage output. Acrobat was on the lower end of the damage spectrum, while simultaneously being one of the more difficult playstyles in the game. Which isn't exactly a great combination. But it was difficult to justify increasing Acrobat's damage, since the ability to sustain infinite flight meant it could ignore most attacks in the game. From a balancing perspective, an archetype deemed as safe as Acrobat shouldn't be doing comparable damage to other DPS archetypes. So for a while, Acrobat remained relatively unchanged. That is until... On January 8, 2025, the official Assassin rework thread dropped detailing proposed changes to the class, including a section on a future Acrobat rework focused on making it riskier in exchange for more damage. This comes in the form of a new mechanic, Dive. The solution to Acrobat's infinite flight was to make the archetype have to touch the ground in order to access higher damage potential. Although there were a few concerns over Acrobat being grounded and potentially too squishy, the general consensus viewed these changes positively, and many were excited for the rework. But with no official date, nobody knew when that rework would arrive. It could be a year, it could be months, it could be the very next month. On February 21st, 2025, the Acrobat rework dropped, and reactions were not so good. The rework had many issues across the board, but before I get into that, it's important to understand how Acrobat previously functioned. But first, a quick disclaimer. I don't have a time machine. Most of my Acrobat footage is post-Ruma, so any demonstrations involving Acrobat from previous patches, I either tried my best to replicate, or I used other people's footage, and the link to those videos will be in the description when applicable. Okay, back to the video. Acrobat has several movement abilities, but the main way to fly involves the Acerate, which replaces Spin Attack as the first spell, as well as Hop, which is a double jump. The Acerate is a multi-part spell. It lunges you forward, does several strikes, then finally launches you upward. Combining a Hop while the Acerate was active allowed you to do a super jump, and the amount of height varied depending on when you timed your hop. The super jump tech was not originally intended, but it brought out potential for skill expression. With enough practice, you had the ability to adjust your height at will by shifting your hop timing, giving you perfect flight control. One of the other goals of the Acro rework was to reduce the barrier to entry and make the archetype more accessible to play. To accomplish this, the super jump tech became a built-in part of Acerate. However, the new super jump gave the same amount of height, regardless of timing. As a result, the flight, the main reason people played Acrobat, felt significantly clunkier. The change was a massive downgrade in terms of versatility, as a single static velocity could never accommodate for all the different situations you would Acerate hop. But what about the rest of the rework? The implementation of the dive system began with Stomp. Falling from 8 blocks or more deals damage when you hit the ground, and this damage scales based on how high you fell from. Stomp provided a basic foundation that would be built upon by Acrobat's new second red note, Swan Dive. Swan Dive introduced Momentum, a new resource obtained through hitting mobs while in the air. Momentum is consumed when you stomp, increasing its damage by 25% per stack, and if you had 3 or more momentum, it would do an additional explosion. The next dash after using Swan Dive also becomes empowered, gaining extra speed and dealing more damage. And hitting an enemy with Swan Dive or this empowered dash would trigger Aerial Ace, which granted a multiplicative damage buff. Finally, we have the changes to Jasmine Boom. After spending 40 mana or building 2 momentum, Acrobat gains 1 boom that does passive damage to everything under it. You can have up to 5, and the more you have, the bigger the area of effect. And hitting a Swan Dive with a full-size boom triggers a stronger explosion and resets it. These nodes were the meat and potatoes of the rework. Unfortunately, the meat was fucking raw and the potatoes rotten. Stomp's damage scaled off of blocks fallen to a maximum height of 20 blocks. But it wasn't worth going that high up since multi-hit and Acerate wouldn't reach, and the stomp multipliers were also horrendous. A full 20 block high, 5 momentum stomp only had a 594 spell multiplier, which for reference is only 8% more damage than a single multi-hit with Mutilate and Finality. Swan Dive and the Jasmine Explosion were also not much better.
Wow!
Momentum was introduced as a new resource that took Acrobat's previous characteristics of flight and many hits, and tied it to the new diving aspect with increased damage. Except it only affected some, and not Swan Dive or Jasmine Boom Explosion. Those two were actually affected by blocks fallen, even though it wasn't mentioned in the ability descriptions. Thanks, by the way. So this meant that with 3 or more momentum, the pink node you got at level 18 did more damage than Swan Dive, the red node that unlocks momentum, which also triggers at 3 momentum. Damage was not the only issue with Swan Dive. If you had 3 or more momentum, Dash would gain increased downward velocity that essentially sent you straight down. This was meant to be a quick way to reach the ground to perform a dive, but this interaction messed with combat cycles. Speaking of which, Acrobat has many different damage sources and you ideally want to combine all of them. So let's run through the 4 main spells. As I mentioned before, Lacerate the several strikes aimed in front of you with a pretty sizable amount of AoE. Dancing Blade doesn't do damage anymore, but Dash does build up shurikens that you can throw by doing a main attack. Multi-hit can be aimed in any direction, and if you hit any part of it, the rest of the hits will connect even if you go out of range, and it ramps up in damage with each hit. Finally, Smoke Bomb does passive damage over time. With the exception of shurikens from Dash, all of these spells are duration spells, meaning casting one of these spells while it's already active will just cancel the previous one and won't increase your damage. So the idea to maximize damage is to have full uptime on the Lacerate, Multi-hit, and Smoke Bomb while squeezing in dashes for shurikens. There's a few ways you can accomplish this, though one of the most popular methods before the rework was 1-3-1-2. Lacerate, Multi-hit, Lacerate dash, then M1 for shurikens and casting Smoke Bomb whenever it's not active. And by cycling mid-air you trigger Weightless, which provides the mana to fuel your spells. But after the rework, 1-3-1-2 and other cycles involving dash for shurikens became significantly more difficult to do. On Acrobat, you typically look down so that you can aim your multi-hit and see the enemy you're trying to hit, but looking down and dashing with momentum meant you get sent straight to the ground. This resulted in many accidental activations that would eat all your momentum before you could reach the max, or just kill you if poorly timed. Although it was meant to assist players with faster diving, it ended up being a mechanic that players had to fight against and work around. The tree structure was also not ideal. If you wanted to grab Mutilate to take advantage of Finality, you are now forced to grab Riding Reflux, aka Acrobat crutches for Weenie Hut Juniors. Before the rework, if you wanted to grab Blazing Powder to increase the Lacerate damage, you had to grab Cheaper Multi-hit 1, which you already wanted to grab anyways because it was good for sustain. But then they removed Cheaper Multi-hit 1 and you had to grab Dagger Proficiency 2 instead. And I don't think I have to explain why the melee range node doesn't really do anything on the flying archetype. As a result, the tree was extremely AP tight. If you wanted Sticky Bomb, Blazing Powder, and Mutilate, that was 9 AP. For 3 nodes that realistically should each only be 1 to 2 AP worth of investment, and I feel especially confident saying that because that's how much they cost to grab on Acrobat right now. The initial Acrobat rework was probably the worst rework we've seen since 2.1 dropped. Although it had some interesting ideas, the execution was not very good, and the numbers across the board were way too low. For reference, a maxed out Jasmine Boom Explosion, falling from 20 blocks in the air, with Aerial Ace active, had a 1980% spell multiplier. A single Vanish backstab with Marks and Knives does 4420%, and you do one of those every second. After many threads and overwhelming community feedback, a hotfix was dropped just 3 days after the rework, and Acrobat continued to receive changes throughout 2.1. I'm only going to cover some of the most important ones because holy shit, what didn't they change? The Lacerate hop's velocity was adjusted and the height from the super jump once again varies depending on when you time the hop. Momentum was reworked so that hitting mobs for 1.5 seconds without stopping grants 1 momentum, which was awful, so they reverted it a month later, and added a 1-tick cooldown to each ability type so it charges at the same rate regardless of how many mobs you hit. Momentum also received several other changes. The cap was doubled in return for having the amount of hits required, and the tier 2 acro aspect further reduced this number. Swan Dive also scales off of momentum now instead of blocks fallen, and Stomp only scales off of blocks now. And speaking of Swan Dive, it went from 200% to 480%, can proc at 1 momentum, and no longer scales off of blocks fallen. The Jasmine Boom Explosion has been moved into a new node called Petal Storm and now triples the damage of Swan Dive. The go 20 blocks up in the air thing has been abandoned in favor of cycling mid-air for momentum and weightless mana, then diving with momentum boosted Petal Storm Swan Dives.
Now that's a lot of damage!
The downward dash part of Swan Dive was replaced with holding shift, which you could do at any point to fast fall. Since it's tied to shift, it means it doesn't work with riding reflex, so ideally, don't take that note. Faster dive also means getting back in the air faster and translates to more DPS. And since its position will swap at mutilate, you can just skip riding reflex now. Common sentiment people had after the rework was that it'd be nice if Acrobat had some way to bounce back up after hitting a dive, and this was eventually added in the form of a reworked Dancing Blade.
Instead of just completely removing Pirouette, I think they should reintroduce it to the archetype with probably Dancing Blade, making it so that if you have +3 momentum and you land a Dancing Blade, it vaults you upwards.
Yeah, that's exactly what they did. Wow, okay. Anyways, I don't like this node, because you can just do this and not waste any AP. Aerial Ace goes up to 45% damage with Aspect, which is a lot of damage. So at the start of a fight, you typically want to proc a 1 momentum dive so you can get that buff as soon as possible. But Dancing Blade only activates at 3+ momentum, so you have to get back in the air without it. Which you can do by just dashing up. A few things about upwards dash. If you do it while looking straight up, you'll go too high and your spells will be out of range. 2 ways to circumvent this. Cast the Acerate immediately after to cancel your vertical momentum, or angle upwards but not straight up. Congrats, you have saved yourself 1 AP. Make sure to spend it responsibly.
Riding reflex.
These were all pretty impactful changes, but Acrobat's usage rate continued to gradually decline for most of Rekindled's remaining lifespan. Although there were major improvements compared to the initial rework, one could argue that the reward still wasn't enough. But of course, this isn't the end of our story. The Fruma expansion added a page 8 to the ability tree of every archetype, with Acrobats in particular being pretty good. First we have Celerity, which increases the damage each momentum stack gives by 2% and increases Dash's horizontal velocity by 10%. 2% might not seem like much, but as you reach higher momentum and stack it with Aerial Ace and Petal Storm, it makes a noticeable difference. The increased horizontal velocity also just makes the archetype feel faster and helps with chasing mobs. Overall, not bad for 1 AP. Next we have... oh, they moved Petal Storm to page 8. I wonder what they swapped it with. I'm sure it's a very balanced and ethical ability that doesn't go against the design philosophy and the entire point of the rework. With Dexterous Hands, Hop can also generate shurikens, and it increases the amount you can store from 9 to 12. Since you're already using Hop to fly, this is just free shurikens. The new Bio-node is Thermobaric Smoke, which reduces Smoke Bomb's total duration by 1 second, but makes it tick 0.3 seconds faster, going from 0.5 seconds to 0.2 seconds a tick, 2 ticks a second to 5 ticks a second. This node is pretty good for Acrobat, and maybe a little too good for a different one. More ticks a second is more DPS, but it also means faster momentum charging and more weightless mana. Momentum needs 15 hits for 1 stack, with the Mythic aspect reducing it to 12. So with Thermobaric, Book Bomb covers 5 of those hits, and Jasmine Beam hits around 3 times a second. So with just passive damage, you only need 4 hits for 1 momentum, and you still have the Acerate, Multi-Hit, and Shurikens. With max aspects, I can get a full 10 momentum Swan Dive in about 5 seconds. And this thing hits pretty hard now. Finally, we have the ultimate. Serpent's Garden sends you straight to the ground, but if you do it while grounded, it'll send you up first before going back down. And upon hitting the ground, you will spawn a field of flowers which damages everything inside of it. The garden itself already does a very respectable amount of damage, but it's what it does to momentum that is most notable. While above the garden, momentum charges twice as fast and caps at 15 instead of 10. Since momentum is now multiplicative instead of additive, a 15 momentum dive is about 1.76 times stronger than at 10 momentum, and it charges as if it was a 7.5 momentum dive, resulting in much more potent dives at a faster rate, in addition to huge amounts of passive damage in a 15 block radius, and the ult has a 20-second duration. However, there are 2 downsides. The first one isn't really an issue with Serpent's Garden specifically, more so ults and the game in general, and it's the fact that outside of Anathema, you don't really get to use the ult very often in raids. The amount of damage you can do is extremely disproportionate to the amount of health mobs actually have, so if you or like anyone else in your party has a competent enough build and can use it effectively, you don't really get to use the ult. The other downside is the fact that the garden is completely stationary. If you're by yourself, it's not too much of an issue, since you control the aggro. But in team content, mobs will aggro other people who can then bring mobs out of your radius. And I'm not gonna ask my P-Finder raid every run to kite the boss inside of my ult. That's kind of excessive, which feels pretty bad for an ult. If this is an intentional decision to balance out how strong the ult is, then I think it's a pretty poor one. Whether or not something stays within the ult isn't something you can always control. Many of the raid bosses have some form of burst movement option that could render your ult useless. And what about situations where the boss just doesn't move? Now you're just doing double damage for 20 seconds. If the ult ranges from does nothing to very OP, then I think it makes more sense to decrease the strength of the ult in return for more consistency. And the solution already exists.
Nice.
Hanafubuki has a major ID that relocates the garden wherever you swan dive. But I'm also not a big fan of that decision. Ana's already often criticized for being a glorified stat stick, and this most recent version of its major ID only exacerbates that. It's not very interesting since it doesn't really change anything about the way you play or even build with it. And again, you don't get to use the ult very often in raids outside of WTP. And if you were to look at the other content in the game, if you need an ult to clear a Ute-Run challenge, you're probably fucked anyways. Oh, I just needed the clip. Okay. Ute runs are also single player, so you can just kite things yourself. And board events have a small enough arena where it doesn't matter. But at the same time, being able to move the garden is an important piece of functionality for the ult. And now let's just lock behind one item. The ult is still very strong, Hana or not, and the rest of these nodes are pretty good. They were all just straight damage increases. And combined with all the various number changes the archetype has received the past year, and well. Yeah, so I think this archetype is actually kind of good now. But first, let's talk about damage in Wynncraft. This is a topic I could probably devote an entire 30-minute video on, so I'll try to keep it short. Of course, archetypes vary in damage, but even within the same archetype, the difference between the low end and the high end makes balancing a Sisyphean task. For some context, I am not the average player. And this isn't me trying to brag about how unemployed I am. Just give me a bit to explain. I use crafteds, I have good rolls on my items, I have good tomes and max aspects, and behind all that is thousands of raids worth of experience. With the different builds I played for this video, with no raid buffs, consus, or outside support, I dealt between 500k to 700k DPS averaged over a 10-second period. This isn't the absolute ceiling of what Acro can do, but it's still pretty high up there. And while 500 to 600k on Hanafubuki is far from game-breaking or out of the ordinary, especially when you compare it to what some of the other archetypes can do, it's also like, still way more damage than this game is clearly intended for. Orpheon, the incarnation of Yet itself, a literal fucking god, has 21.6 million HP. But with raid buffs, I only need to hit it for like half a minute for it to keel over. The mid-phase cutscene now is younger than that. Of course there's some downtime in the fight, but there's also supposed to be 3 other people with me doing damage at the same time. Orpheon does have a lower health because there's a second boss, but the non-WTP bosses are still not much better. It's pretty telling that outside of WTP, I've only been able to get the ult when at least one person dies or when the boss is basically already dead. And most of my runs were in P-Finder, not pre-mades where I can guarantee 3 other sweaty no-lives to annihilate the boss in 2 nanoseconds. Again, I am not the average player, and I don't think the game should be balanced around the top percentage of players. You can make the argument that Acrobat isn't very good unless you're specifically min-maxing, skilled with the archetype, and have all the aspects. And yeah, I'd agree, especially in regards to aspects. The difference with and without aspects is pretty absurd, as without them, my DPS is cut in half. Most of these aspects provide faster momentum charging, more damage, more mana, and sometimes all 3 at the same time. Faster momentum charging and more mana also translates to more DPS. So some aspects are basically triple dipping in terms of output. I think it would be a good idea to shift some power from the aspects into the base kit, but besides that, how do you buff the archetype without also buffing the top percentage of players? Most number changes would also probably benefit those with aspects more than those without. If you buff dive damage, well, guess who charges it faster? Little Timmy who just finished Apotheosis for the first time, or Big Tom with 10,000 WTP completions on Acrobat? I don't think the solution is to just say, fuck it, and make everyone start doing 7-digit DPS, since that creates a bigger disparity that makes balancing even harder. The difference between 250k and 600k is still much smaller than say 500k and 1.2 million. But the main reason why I wanted to make this video and examine the history behind Acrobat's rework is the supposed risk-reward ratio, which right now I think is the most skewed in favor of reward it has ever been for the archetype. The point of diving was to introduce some risk into an otherwise safe archetype to justify higher damage output. And since then, the damage has gone up significantly to the point where it's possible to reach numbers Acro players used to dream of hitting prior to Fruma. But the risk? The current iteration of Acro is arguably the safest it has ever been since the rework, while also being the most rewarding. First, I want you to guess how much AoE a Swan Dive has. It's 12. Touching the ground for a second at most doesn't matter when you're outside of the attack range of most mobs, and with Pedal Storm it's actually 15 blocks AoE, which makes diving not very risky. Diving was meant to be dangerous, but also something you can do without just dying. Design-wise, if you're proficient enough with the archetype, it should be possible to dive without having to take any damage. But the original 5-block AoE was a bit too small to the point where damage was just unavoidable sometimes, which feels awful on an archetype meant to be evasive. 15 blocks is also not exactly what I would consider dangerous. And diving also, I'm just gonna read this ability. Braced Impact. Landing with Swan Dive briefly grants you resistance. Effect: 50% resistance bonus to self. Duration: 2 seconds. 1 AP. Assassin is already tied for the highest base resistance, so with enough raw HP, it can already comfortably tank some hits even with no defense investment. Adding an extra 50% damage resistance on top of that makes it pretty durable, as you would need to either get one shot, which is pretty uncommon for the most part, what the fuck, or get hit multiple times before you have a chance to drink a potion. But again, you're kinda not supposed to be getting hit very often in the first place. Burst Impact also has no cooldown. I don't get how this node is a thing, since it kinda goes against the point of the rework. Who cares about touching the ground if you take half damage once you do so? The ability nullifies any risk from diving and rewards you by further reducing risk afterwards, since 2 seconds is enough to cover the time back up, as well as part of your airtime. And going back to aspects for a second, I mentioned how, so some aspects are basically triple dipping in terms of output. With Burst Impact, these aspects are actually quadruple dipping, since faster momentum charging is more frequent dives, which means higher Burst Impact uptime percentage, aka more survivability. And I'm aware that Betelmonk is right there, also flies and has even more crazy EHP abilities, but the existence of one archetype doesn't make a different one worse. Something, holy shit, 2 cakes. In terms of archetypes, Acrobat is definitely up there for mechanical difficulty, with a pretty intimidating skill filler for many players. And for a while, the reward just wasn't there. It also isn't the fucking Dark Ages anymore. Taking a step back and just looking at everything the archetype has to offer, it has fantastic survivability. With enough practice, you can easily maneuver around and dodge just about every attack in the game with flight. You also have on-demand access to 50% damage resistance by doing something you're already doing, while having 100% base resistance. It has good AoE and mob clear with its spells, Jasmine Doom, and Swan Dives. And although there's definitely a major aspect variance that gatekeeps what's possible on the archetype, if you're able to get past that, then you have a very consistent archetype that can solo clutch wins comfortably and relatively quickly. Out of all the archetypes I've played for videos, Acrobat and Monk are the ones I felt were the best at just raw dogging P-Finder. The reward is very much there right now. Sure, it's far from meta, but who cares? Even at its worst, there are people that still play Acrobat for one simple reason: it's fun. And right now, it's the strongest the archetype has ever been, while also not being so overwhelmingly strong to the point where you don't get to play the game. The archetype isn't perfect, of course. I haven't even talked about wall jump, and there are some other things that I think could be improved. As it stands though, I think this archetype is a lot more capable than most people give it credit for. And if you have an assassin, I think it's worth trying out if you haven't already. The experience was fun though. End of the day, I'm still a Shade player at heart. Boom! Montage!